Good afternoon. Thank you for joining Otava and our Java with Otava series. Today we're going to be focusing on ransomware. We have a roundtable of subject matter experts joining us today. We're going to be speaking about a number of topics at high level, reviewing ransomware, its current position in market, some of the risks or challenges it presents to us as consumers, and then looking at more proactively how we can understand risk and mitigation strategies, both from a business and from a technical perspective. And of course, all of this will be flavored, obviously, by processes going on in today's world due to COVID and the pandemic management structure and the impact that that has on this process today. So with that said, before we start and introduce the panelists, we would definitely encourage audience participation. Number one, this is Java with Otava, so hopefully you have your coffee ready. Number two, if there are any questions, do come up if you want to interject some thoughts or other discussion topics. All of our attendees today will be on mute, but I do encourage you, all right, I do encourage you to use the chat function of GoToWebinar. And we'll be assisted today by Carrie from our marketing team, who will then direct the questions back into the panelists today. So with that public service announcement covered, let's introduce the panelists. I'll start briefly. Jeremy Bigler, I'm the Director of Product Management here at Otava, and I'll be the moderator for the day's conversations. But the folks you're going to be hearing from predominantly are first and foremost, Whit, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself and a little bit about your organization.
My name is Whit Eric. I run an MSP out of San Marcos, Texas. We have around 3,000 endpoints focusing primarily on medical, financial, some hospital, a lot of urgent care, pediatric, etc. Your average doctor, etc. We're full-blown MSP. We don't do any block hours or any of that stuff. So we manage all of our customers' networks.
All right. Whit is one of the customers we have joining us today on the panel. The second customer that we have joining us today is Howard. Howard, if you could go ahead and give a 5-minute overview, sir.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm Howard Trumbull. I'm the product manager at JMARK. We are a MSP based in Springfield, Missouri. We've been in business for 30 years. Clients nationwide, about every vertical you can imagine. So our solutions, they're very varied, right? So our JMARK offers really a comprehensive services based around a people first, technology second philosophy. We are really designed to enhance business operations and increase business success.
All right, thank you, Howard. We have Hill Country and JMARK joining us from a client perspective. We're also joined by Brandon. Brandon comes to us from our partner Veeam. Brandon, if you could give us some details about yourself, sir.
Sure. My name is Brandon McCoy, Senior System Engineer here at Veeam Software. Today is actually my 3rd year anniversary with Veeam, and I only support MSP, so working with all the lovely folks that we have on the call today to see how Veeam works with cloud and managed service providers. Happy to be here.
Excellent. And last but absolutely not least, Adam joins us. Adam is Otava's Chief Security and Compliance Officer. Adam, if you want to give us just a high-level thumbnail, sir.
Sure. So we take care of the ongoing security compliance needs for Otava, assist with the coordination and orchestration of all of Otava's security certifications that we have and maintain. So thank you very much for having me.
All right, definitely appreciate that. Gentlemen, thank you for taking your time to join us this afternoon to talk about ransomware. While we're working on some of the slide challenges here, let's see. We have a number of interesting scenarios that we see going on in today's industry, right? Ransomware is a hot topic. It is something that I think we, if not have experienced ourselves, certainly have through the 7 degrees of separation, right? had some impact with, or know of organizations have impact with. Carrie, if you could go on to the next one, please. All right. We see a number of organizations here. They're fairly large organizations, right? What are some of the things that these organizations all have in common? And I think you could probably sense the leading direction here, but if audience at home, if you want to type in a few ideas there, feel free. Let's go on to the next slide, please. The issue is all of these have been victims of ransomware, right? In fact, we've seen some significant increase in ransomware attacks, or at least attack vectors recently. In fact, one of the data elements we'll see here shortly, between February and March, there was a 148% increase in ransomware attack vectors alone, right? And let's think about some of the drivers here. One, we have distributed workforce with the COVID-19 pandemic going on. A lot of us are sheltering at home. A lot of organizations have embraced mobile or distributed workforce solutions. And let's face it, I think we all understand that those environments may not be as secure as what we would typically expect to see in a premises-based environment. We also see in any type of a DR scenario, and quite candidly, COVID-19 is exactly that in terms of how we're handling it. That is when an organization is most exposed to any type of attack vectors. So all of these horror stories that you see in front of you here are fairly consistent or similar from others that we've experienced, and I'm certainly that you've probably heard about or may even know that have taken place in the market already. With that said, we did want to talk, and next slide, please, Carrie. We did want to talk a little bit about the impact of ransomware, right? This is all good news information, but what's the real impact here? And we see a number of big numbers on this slide, right? 11.5 billion in 19 from ransomware payouts, right? Now understand that although the number has increased to about 98%, there's no guarantee that these organizations paying money are actually getting a functional unlock key. So they are gambling essentially, and even paying the ransom that they're going to actually be able to unlock or recover their data. 300% increase in attacks year over year from 18 to 19. Gentlemen on the panel here, what are some of your thoughts? What are some of your experiences in this arena? Have you guys seen, and Howard and Whit specifically, have you guys seen increases in your customer markets from either attacks or hopefully not, but maybe penetrations?
Yeah, I definitely feel like there's more attacks. We see it on a very consistent basis, especially since rolling out security awareness training. Through the process of that, we're even more notified of the attacks, and because we're sending out bulletins to customers that appear to be impacted and stuff like that. So it's crazy too. Anytime there's a major event, you see a surge. So even holidays, we see a surge. You see a surge around COVID. We saw a surge of ransomware. It's just, they just try to catch people off guard. They kind of catch people making change. So, I've even seen where a new employees, I guess as soon as they go on LinkedIn and post they're working somewhere, they'll get hit with it. It's not as random as it used to be. It definitely feels like very directed and pointed attacks towards people.
Now, I know one thing that we did see with some of these statistics, right? And this is backed by a VMware analysis that was done as part of their security process. FinTech seems to be one of the most targeted markets today. Howard, I know JMARK does a lot of work in the financial services industry. What's been your experience here?
Same as Whit. So the threat surface from spam and phishing is huge. We're also rolling out threat assessment scenarios, and really we are monitoring it more, but it is happening more. So you get to see much more of it. The rate of phishing is through the roof, as your slide there shows. Protecting against it, creating those human firewall elements are so critical right now. You can block spam and block domains, but again, to Whit's point earlier, it is so targeted and focused now that it's not just going to happen to be caught by a filter. It's going to look like legitimate email. It's going to look like something that you're trying to get. It looks exactly like an email that you want, except that it's been hijacked by bad guys.
I know we've seen recently, and this was a statistic out of last month, we've seen on average, right, phishing or similar malware attacks in the magnitude of 1.5 million emails a day going out to organizations. Let's flip to the next slide, please, Carrie. Now, as we see these attacks skyrocket again, finance being, I think, really the focus here in at least the pandemic portion of ransomware. Ransomware probably will survive COVID-19 for the foreseeable future, and obviously was around before. But we've also seen other spikes that I think follow some of the interesting things that we see in both our pandemic response. And again, going back to that VMware data, we do see some significant spikes in based on national notifications and other initiatives. And we see increase, obviously, in just general attack vectors as well. I'm curious, Brandon, from a Veeam perspective, you guys sort of sit on top and aggregate a lot of information from folks like Otava and other providers and end users in the industry. What has been the provider view or exposure into this phenomenon?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's interesting to get the inputs from specific service providers that deal in specific sectors. But as has been said before, everyone is at risk, right? Every sector, every vertical, from the small mom and pop shops all the way up to, the big financial industries, the government. And a lot of times we see that these ransomware attacks are based on the run rate of the business. So, one ransomware string may ask for a couple $100, the other ones may ask for hundreds of thousands of dollars. But it's the same attack vectors, and it's usually the same methodology that we'll explore a little bit in the next few slides in terms of Trojans, email attachments, clicking on the wrong links. And I think during this time specifically, we're seeing a lot more of that where everyone's working from home, so they're not on the corporate network. They may be, clicking on links that they wouldn't otherwise, especially around the pandemic, getting information about stimulus checks or the coronavirus stats, and just being a little more curious and clicking on things that we normally wouldn't. We're definitely seeing some spikes there as well.
And last but not least, Adam, from a CISO perspective, right, as we look at not only security but also compliance, right? How do we see compliance fitting into this? Obviously, ransomware puts everything in jeopardy, but for organizations like fintech or healthcare or similar that are compliance, legislative requirements driven, what's been sort of the impact that you've seen?
Well, the reality is a lot of these companies that, traditionally, like, it was so Brandon was talking about the examples of the different ransomware attacks and the vectors that they're hitting in on and the topics that they're hitting. It's a different world right now in that, now all of a sudden we've got companies that have distributed staff, sitting at home, et cetera. It's not as easy to just go down to the IT cube and, go ask a question or tap somebody on the shoulder. So, that's at least in part, that dependency on the security awareness training really starts to increase during this period. Security and compliance initiatives, are also strained during this period, because now that staff that you had at your local office is now again distributed, and so it's a struggle for those companies that are trying to maintain their security and compliance requirements through this process.
Got it. Makes perfect sense. Kara, if you wouldn't mind jumping forward. So let's take a moment and define ransomware. I think we all generally understand the concept, right? Bad actors come in and they somehow gain control of our information assets. They encrypt those, and then they promise to send us the magic key to unlock our access or information once we send them some type of payment, usually in Bitcoin or crypto in an untraceable format to some third-party address. Now, what we have seen, thankfully, over the last 6 to 8 months is the rate of successful recovery has been increasing from 94% just almost a year ago to about 98% fairly recently. But that's still, we're paying money to essentially reclaim our own information, and B, it's not 100% guarantee that we're even going to be able to reclaim our information. I'm curious, Brandon, I know Veeam plays a significant role, as well as others, in protecting against ransomware. From a technical aspect, right? What are some of the commonalities of how these attack vectors propagate, gain entry and propagate within our environments?
Yeah, great question. So some of the stats on the right-hand side are really of some of the slides that we see here are some of the biggest vectors. So email attachments being number one, right? And like Howard had mentioned earlier, these emails seem like they're from a LinkedIn source or someone in your company, someone you know, or some kind of information that you're interested in. We also see removable media. There was actually a study done by 2 college universities as well as Google. I think this was 2 or 3 years ago, where a USB stick was dropped in public places. Nothing malicious on it, rather just a tracking device to see who would put that USB stick into a PC. And almost half of the people that found it did, indeed plug that in. So curiosity killing the cat. Things being left around, sticking them into your computer. We also see malvertising, SMS attacks. So maybe you're browsing a website and you get a pop-up that says your Adobe, Flash player needs to be updated. And perhaps it does, but rather than clicking on some random link, it's probably a lot better to just, this is the slide I was mentioning. Thank you. It's probably a lot better to go to that website and download those from a reliable source rather than just clicking on things that pop up. So, at the end of the day, we are the gatekeepers, whether you're just an employee or you're the IT admin, they have to get in some way. You have to give them some sort of permission. So just be smart about before you click on something, before you go to a link, before you download something.
Sounds like, Brandon, that's a good reinforcement for what Adam was talking about earlier, really around awareness and good information stewardship, behavior training, and reinforcement. Very good. Howard or Whit, no names, please, but have you had any customers that have been a victim of ransomware, and sort of help us understand maybe those experiences and the journey that they've had to undertake to recover or restore their services?
I can speak to it a little bit. We had one that was ransomware, but thankfully we are a Veeam partner. I think I can say that safely on the call, right? As a Veeam and Otava partner, we really didn't have any problems restoring that data because we do follow Veeam's best practices. We do follow 3-2-1 rules, for backing up our systems. And the client made a mistake. It was a mistake that anybody can make. After we reviewed it, hardly any of us really had any shame in what happened. I said, wow, that's terrible, but because we do follow these policies, we do follow these best practices, the client had very minimal downtime and was back up within the same day. So that's a story that we used, actually. You take a negative and turn it into a positive. These attacks are going to happen. There's only 2 types of companies that haven't been hit and companies that have, right? So that's kind of the way we see it, for sure.
Makes sense. Wed, how about you? Anything in the Hill Country portfolio?
Yeah, it doesn't ever matter as many layers you have. I feel like everyone has had some exposure to this, and you haven't. You just aren't looking yet. But yeah, it always comes back to your protection and layers. People, customers would say, "Oh, I've got all these things. Aren't I okay?" And the matter of fact is, no. We have to continue to be vigilant in adding layers. Obviously backups are your key, but I would even say if you have one backup vendor, you're not doing your best. You need multiple backup vendors because there's, you have one backup vendor, they find a way to attack that backup vendor, and you should have another, and even then they'll just attack that one, right? So it's all about layers and isolation, and then making sure the end users understand that their mean time to recovery. What is it going to take to get back from this scenario and this scenario? Having those upfront conversations so that they're not surprised the day it happens, and in practicing, what is it going to look like? What are you going to have? We have a lot of organizations that are 24/7, so we do maintenance windows. Sometimes we not going to lie, we force them into downtime procedures just so they have practice. So they have practice running without the system. So they have practice, oh, we don't have this and this and this. Well, okay, print out some of those forms, be ready, and have a plan. So I think it's continuing, and not always is that continuing software as it is more education and meetings and plans and everybody knowing what to do when it happens. So
makes sense. So I think this is a really good transition to our next subject. Before we transition off into some of the mitigation factors that we can take, pardon me, both from a technical as well as a business perspective, I'd like to open it up quickly to the audience. You are still on mute. However, if there's any questions regarding ransomware, the types of attack vectors out there, or risks that may pose to your organization, or just general questions about the risk itself, feel free to put those into your chat box, and we'll get those addressed here in real time. So with that said, Carrie, if you wouldn't mind advancing one here. What I would like to do is now talk a little bit more around some of the mitigation processes here. Let's start first with technical, right? Howard, you had mentioned the concept of a 3-2-1 backup strategy, right? Obviously, that's pretty well known in the Veeam world. But Brandon, if you wouldn't mind, sir, could you just sort of give us a high-level view for those of us that may not be familiar with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 3-2-1 rule, ever since I started in the IT world, I've heard that over and over. And basically it means having 3 copies of your data on 2 different devices, and one of those being offsite. So your first copy is actually the production data itself. Then you have a local copy of that on some sort of disk media. And then you have the second one offsite. And mostly what I see that it being is what we call Cloud Connect. So Cloud Connect is Veeam's way of allowing an MSP to give their customers multi-tenant storage with no VPNs. Now you've got a copy of your data offsite. So not only from just ransomware, but what if your building burns down, or what if your storage array goes out, right? So having that offsite in a completely different data center, a completely different network, completely isolated, that's the 3-2-1 rule in a nutshell.
Gotcha. We do have a question coming in from our audience. And Brandon, you're probably the closest to this. Where can we find Veeam best practices for data protection?
Absolutely. So there's a couple things. If we're talking specifically about ransomware, there are some white papers where we'll talk about some of the common best practices, 3-2-1 obviously being a big one. Just in general, if you actually Google Veeam best practices, we have a Veeam best practice document, and it'll walk you through everything from sizing the Veeam resources to where to put them in your environment, separation of roles, and I believe it also has some security hardening as well. But we have all kinds of white papers, recorded webinars that dive deeper into ransomware as well.
Perfect, thank you. So I think one of the challenges, right, we're still on the risk mitigation topic, one of the challenges that we see, Gartner recently, as of April 3rd, did a survey for CFOs, right? And they predicted, based on that survey, that 74% of the respondents intend to shift some or all of their workforce to a distributed workforce model following COVID-19, not just as a pandemic safeguard, but now as a new business go forward, right? And this factors into the new normal that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But I'm curious, from a risk mitigation, right? What are some of the technical aspects that we can do to help safeguard a distributed workforce that may not be within a controlled, or the perception of controlled, 4 walls and organization-owned equipment?
Yeah, I can jump in there. So in terms of Veeam, what Veeam has seen over the last X number of years, even before I started with the company, and we had a very defined goal. We backed up VMware, and that was it. And now we have something what we like to call the Veeam Availability Platform, and we've kind of changed our vision or our motto statement to be the #1 leader in cloud data management, and that's hybrid cloud. So, we see workloads in Azure AWS. We have products that natively back up and take snapshots of both of those. Some of those are very new. For Azure and AWS, we have agents for physical machines. We can protect, your private cloud workloads, and then we have MSPs that offer Cloud Connect, so you have that offsite disaster recovery, being able to spin up in another data center. And in addition to that, one thing I heard very recently, which was very interesting, was that we always think about ransomware or buildings that burn down or some kind of things like that, but nobody had really ever thought about what we're dealing with now, and the fact that you may not even be able to leave your house, right? So you may have all your stuff in the data center, but if you can't get there, right? You're on lockdown. So having it somewhere else where people are able to access that data and having it at your fingertips, I think, is just another changing evolution in terms of IT and what we're dealing with now.
Gotcha. Thank you, Brandon. That's some good information. In fact, it raises an interesting point, right, around how do we access safely and securely, right, data that may be in our data centers, right, through either company-owned devices that are remote, or bring your own device, right, employee-owned devices that we may or may not have any governance over. What I know, Hill Country has a pretty big presence in application virtualization, right, similar to that style model that you're using with your healthcare clients. How has that played a role in this scenario for you guys?
It kind of made it just a overnight transition for those customers. They, the ones that have already done the migration, have already done those changes to the virtual infrastructure. Matter of clicks, they're ready to go. We don't have to change any policies or plans, or the two-factor is already enabled. They already know how to log in. It's really just another day in the neighborhood for them. And most of those customers, we didn't even really hear from. They're like, hey, we're going to work from home. Okay, thanks for calling. That's cool. Have fun at home. And here's our little white paper on working from home and checking how you're making sure your internet's working, so you don't call me when Spectrum's acting up or whatever. It's great, but you can't always do that. You can't always have that plan, but it sure does make it easy when they already live and die in that world. So it's just another day in the neighborhood. And funny enough, a lot of those customers have, I'd say we have about 10 of them that are already that way. I think 8 have decided they're probably not going to go back to the office full time ever. They're going to stay with this flexible workplace because it's fine. They're happy, they're okay, and they're productive.
I can certainly see that from a cost reduction, cost control standpoint, moving away from physical premise and the productivity time loss just in commuting. Makes perfect sense. Howard, y'all are doing a bunch of work up there in the finance space, as I mentioned before. How do you see your financial customers responding here to a distributed computing model?
So compliance environments like medical and banking and financial services as a whole, they do have to operate a little bit differently. They're not just beholden to themselves, they're actually beholden to compliance entities. So there are certain rules they have to follow and certain reporting mechanisms that they have to, be able to report to. So we have seen quite a few of them move to that offsite work. Same as WIT on that one. They like it. We proved that we could do it, and we could do it securely. And then they said, well, why not continue to do this? What's the problem? So there isn't one. Is really the good thing, right? They were able to be effective. They are able to work securely every single day, and we do have the means to make to reduce the risk, to manage the endpoints, to create the acceptable threat surface for being at home and being as productive as you would be in the office. So a lot of them already had the environment. They may not have had, as many VPN licenses as they wanted, or as many terminal connections ready to go as they wanted. No one really thought that they were ever going to do over 50% of their, workforce from home. So after making sure that those settings were there, everybody could work from home. The challenges that we saw were some of the maybe the convergence suites, like the working with Zooms, not to name a product, but different collaboration suites. Any of those collaboration suites, how do we get everybody on it? Maybe there were certain teams that could use it, but not all teams. The cross collaboration teams were, maybe marketing knew how to do it, but not HR. So now you have to make sure that everybody can use it as effectively. So that was one of the things that we saw. But the pain is over, if there was any. They have done it. They've made the transition. So now in a post-COVID world, we're looking at working from home, being a more accepted day-to-day. And for me, as somebody that created networks that were so flexible, so secure and so able to move anywhere, I love it.
So Howard, that raises another interesting point, really, which, and I think we've talked about this briefly before, is this really looks like a disaster recovery, right, scenario, right? Fire in my building, power gets knocked out, physical infrastructure is jeopardized or put into a non-performance state. Adam, from your experience in working with organizations for DR and continuity planning, right? This type of a structure, both in terms of security and how do we handle secure access even in a recovery model, as well as how do we plan for recover for hopefully a non-emergent situation like COVID-19 again. Is this something that organizations should think about when they're doing continuity and disaster planning?
Yeah, I think that certainly there's no question that that the notion of COVID was something everybody wasn't saying, hey, I know it's going to come next week, so this is probably one of the larger extremes in terms of the impacts to workforce movement. But certainly with the vast majority of the compliance standards that are out there, there are tasks and items that need to be done, both from a business continuity planning, a risk mitigation strategy planning, incident response planning. And for the majority of the major, kind of certifications that are out there, those also will require, periodic testing, typically at least once a year, that type of thing. So, while, we needed to go and pick everybody up and move them, this was kind of like this is like the exercising of the most extreme, we can't go to the office event, that I think any of us are going to see in our lifetime. So in one sense, I think it was a good experience for those organizations that, maybe hadn't spent as much time on the, kind of more extreme ends of their testing regimen, and it uncovered a number of things. I'm positive that Howard and Whit were, and their crew was like heads down trying to get clients configured and set up and transitioned into this remote workforce. But certainly, I think this should teach everybody a good lesson, which is that, hey, it sounds like it's just busy work, but the proactive testing, the scenario running, tabletop exercises across all of those domains is certainly something that really helps organizations prepare for, events like this. And, you've got to kind of allocate for major events.
No, I appreciate that. No, it makes sense, right? Is as we look at workforce or site unavailability, right? This is what this essentially looks like. Is how do we connect? One question that did come in, and this is a little bit technical, so before we transition over to some of the business mitigation components, Brandon, this is probably directed to you, is understanding that some of the ransomware attack vectors involve engaging BitLocker or similar encryption technologies for data, both backup data and production data. Would using the encryption option within Veeam mitigate some of that risk, or what would be Veeam's position there around the benefit of encrypting the backups?
Yeah, great question. So we do work with BitLocker, but there are some functionalities that may present problems. Things like restoring, file level restore. Being able to read a Veeam backup and pull out granular objects isn't supported when you have a BitLocker encrypted drive. So if you want to use BitLocker, you can. but you're going to have to restore, for instance, entire volumes or entire machines. Veeam does use AES 256, encryption at rest, encryption in transit. The Cloud Connect that I mentioned earlier is TLS, or transport layer security. So Veeam has all kinds of built-in encryption functionality at a very high standard that will allow you to have both the ease of use from a Veeam restore perspective as well as that security. And so we normally recommend that you use the Veeam encryption, but either one is fine.
And then a follow-up question, I think, to that would be then if I do have an encrypted data store using your AES 256-bit encryption, would ransomware still be able to hijack that data store through another encryption layer and hold that hostage or ransom?
Yeah, the answer is probably. It's a cat and mouse game. I've seen some ransomware strains. There's one in particular called, I believe it's pronounced SAMMAS, SAMMAS, and it actually deletes backups. So it'll not only encrypt the production data, but then it'll just delete your backup files. It looks for backup file extensions. Veeams are known as VBKs, VIBs. That's no secret. So yeah, there's always the possibility, and like some of the other gentlemen on the call were saying, layers, isolation, multiple copies of backups, maybe even multiple types of repository OSs. Those are all things to help you. The only real way to be protected from ransomware is to turn the thing off, not have it connected to the internet. So,
Gap, right? And then a follow-up question I know that also came in is right now Veeam obviously runs in Windows-based environments. Is there plans or is there consideration for Linux or other distribution OS-based variants to avoid some of the classic known Windows exploits?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's two parts to that response. So the first is, we are in Veeam version 10 now. We do support Linux proxies. So the application itself still requires Windows, and yes, that has most of the important information in terms of the SQL database where a lot of the information is kept. But in terms of the data mover services, those can be Linux proxies. More specific to the ransomware question, Veeam is a Windows application. I don't see that changing in terms of the GUI. However, we do offer the ability to use Linux as a repository. And that's not to say that Linux still can't be targeted, but some customers I've even seen have both, a Windows OS repository and a Linux OS repository. I always like to say I've never seen, at least yet, a ransomware that was bilingual. So usually it's going to go after one OS or the other. So those are some options around there from a Linux perspective.
Very good. A more generic question, again, still in the technical vein here, is right, we have the ability to promote distributed workforce in really two modes here, right? One mode would be allow folks to have information local on their endpoint devices and then bidirectionally communicate back into our data centers. The second would be using an application virtualization technology or an abstraction layer, such as a VDI technology or an RDS technology, to virtualize those workloads and then simply share mouse clicks and screen scrapes back and forth to endpoints. I think I know the preference here from the team, but Adam, I'd be curious from a security perspective. Howard and Whit, I'd be curious from a customer usability and support, ticket volume, similar complexity perspective here.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that there's a large volume of considerations that need to go into that decision of local, basically local machines versus remoting into machines. And there's some positives and negatives of kind of each of those options. Certainly one of the elements or areas that going and remoting into a VDI system has as an advantage is that you have the ability to then control the backups of those machines. It's not getting lost. It's all backed up, et cetera. Especially with this kind of quick move to a remote and distributed workforce. That's definitely one of the considerations is the backups of of those local devices themselves. But I'll hand it over to Howard and then to Whit to jump in and share some of their experiences.
Yeah, I concur with Adam on that one. You really have to look at what's best for the business and what is going to be supported for their applications, their line of business, and for, the most clients, the most employees, so they get their best return on investment. But ultimately, there's two sides of it. If you allow a VDI technology to be, what you're using predominantly, then, the bad actors, they're in the system. So if they get in, they're in the system. If the bad actor gets into an endpoint, they're only into an endpoint. And unless you have, perhaps weak policies for VPN or network traversal, they may still only be on the endpoint. And the worst thing that happens is they get one user as opposed to getting your entire environment. So whenever you're managing, those VDI environments, yeah, everything gets ramped up. Everything becomes enterprise level type of management, and the policies are, you've got to scrutinize them so much more. But it really depends on what's going to be best for the client and, their line of business.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. We make a lot of the same decisions, and most of it comes down to the most, like we're talking about with layers, right? How can we add the most layers in there, and also control? I mean, each method has its advantages, and I think it's more a conversation about which of those advantages apply to you the most, which is the most feasible, which is the most scalable. What are your company goals? Like, you got a company that's growing a whole lot, well, then going VDI might make a lot more sense sooner than later, or even if they change their size a lot, they might, because they can scale up and down more efficiently than they can with physical, so there's a billion, there's a lot of, not a billion, there's a lot of different variables. So it's just literally, there's not like checkbox A, go this way, checkbox B, go this way. It's probably not even that granular for one entire customer. So it's going to be the technology has to support the business. The business won't support the technology. So
that makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. To wrap up on the technical point of view, then, with a distributed model seeming to be indicative of maybe the new normal coming out of COVID-19 and this environment, gentlemen, are there some general best practices that we can leave this portion of the conversation and the audience with around how to secure some of those distributed environments, right? Things like the proper virtual access, right? Two-factor or multi-factor authentication on VPN tunnels and similar, right? Good identity management, right? Appropriate physical security, not just in your office buildings, but also in the homes, right? To protect those endpoint devices.
Yeah,
things like that.
We have a lot of things that we use around that. So it's things like geo-filtering, where logins are allowed, improbable travel detection, two-factor detection, or not detection, enabling two-factor. And then, if you've bought all this fancy security for your work environment, but not extended it to their home environments, are you truly getting the value out of that? So extending that security out to the home environment so that you have the same level of protection there is important. We tend to try to only use applications that integrate and consolidate so that we have that one pane of glass, the consolidated logs, the consolidated controls, the single two-factor tool, not multiple two-factor tools. You're making sure you have that tight security integration from the get-go, and you're not just kind of ad hocing it is super important. So, looking at the tools before you buy them, how am I going to secure this tool? Because the tool A, application A might look great, be cost effective, but if you can't secure it, what's the point, right? So it's got to be the whole picture, and how many layers of security can you put on there, right? And every one is a plus, and the best ones I like are the ones that are passive and don't require the users to do anything, and that's your geo filtering and your improbable travel, and even access times. It's so simple. Like, if your staff's allowed to work 8 to 5, why do you allow logins after 5?
Good point.
So, that's free. Most everything can do that kind of stuff. So, and turn that on a lot. Just turn off access on Saturday and Sundays. No lie, we see an uptick of stuff over holidays. They love Easter and Christmas because they know IT staff are down. The guy who knows how to lock down firewalls probably not there. So turn off access to begin with. It's too easy, you know, and you have to have that conversation. Otherwise, you don't come up with those ideas on security.
Gotcha. No, it makes perfect sense. Adam, how about
Yeah, I was gonna jump in because you know, with this with this sudden move, during the COVID situation, it's something that a lot I can say from organizations that I've spoken with, very few of them have really thought about what are the impacts from a security perspective of going and employees going and working from home. Because the minute that you do that, you now have, like you're subject to the whatever security that the home user has surrounding their wireless connection, surrounding their home routers, things along those lines. So certainly, as part of this, it's a realm that I still see a lot of people not putting enough thought into, because think about it. When the users go home. You've got any number of devices that are sitting on that internal network. I mean, how many of those networks are sitting with, old Windows 7 boxes, maybe even XP boxes, and, just wildly vulnerable devices that are hooked up to the same wireless network the employee is sitting on. So there's just a lot of consideration. It's really one of the big concerns I've got about the home use now is the home network breach, where it's able to jump back over to the local host on that network. And then at that point in the game, even if I'm rocking a VPN back over to my corporate network, well, now I'm tunneling through that, et cetera. So, it's just things that organizations, haven't really put a lot of thought into, because before, remote work was just an exception or a special thing that would happen.
Well, that brings up an interesting concept of risk, right? We look now at sort of the business side of the house, and we think about really we're in a multi-governance risk posture, right? We can't, as a service provider, we can't absorb all that risk because we can't control or don't own or don't have governance over all of those home devices or those remote devices that you just spoke of, Adam. So really, there seems to be an opportunity, I think, to do a shared risk model here. Howard, Whit, any thoughts there around how your organization handles a distributed risk discussion?
Absolutely. So we have definitely engaged our clients in this sort of understanding. You can have layers on layers on layers, and if they choose to decline a layer, there's a reason that we're putting that layer in place. That layer is securing some aspect of that threat surface. Whether it's something as simple as a firewall or antivirus, or it's something as relatively new as SIM, security information and event management systems. If they decline something like that we absolutely believe is necessary to protect their environment, we cannot be liable for that risk. They have to accept that risk, and sometimes they do, and that's okay. It's understanding that risk exists. We have a way to mitigate it. We are declining that risk. It doesn't happen very often. JMARK got really great clients where, they really believe in us and believe in protecting their network. So we've had really great conversations. But it is possible, where they say, we don't really want to pay for that, or that's not something that we believe is necessary. No problem. Sign here, please, because when that event occurs, you cannot hold us in fixing that environment or sue us for the data that was compromised or breached. That's just not acceptable. The losses can be very large these days. You have medical clients that are worth millions and banking clients that are worth billions. And it's just not something that the insurance of any company can hold.
That brings up another good point around cyber liability coverage, right? I know a lot of organizations out there, this is a new insurance area. A lot of organizations are evaluating cyber liability insurance. Adam, thoughts there around how a cyber liability policy or protection may play into this changing landscape?
Sure. Well, the reality is that the companies that are dealing in dealing with digital data, sensitive data, whether it's, medical, credit cards, just intellectual property, customers, et cetera. Looking at that cyber liability insurance, if you don't have it already, is be a great idea. But one of the common things that I've seen in organizations is that oftentimes you've got somebody internally that is the one that fills out the insurance paperwork, right? And in a lot of these organizations, whoever fills out the insurance paperwork, sweet, that works out great. But part of that application process includes a whole series of checkboxes. Are you performing this function? Do you do this for security, et cetera? Those questionnaires are starting to get extremely, take on an extreme level of depth. And, what some organizations may not realize is that somebody internally is, going down the line, checking all the boxes, et cetera, but are you really doing all that stuff? And so, I'd strongly encourage those organizations to, go take a look at, double check your coverage, double check the application process, double check what you're signing up for, et cetera. Because one of the biggest risks for organizations is if you were to have some type of a cyber event, the very first thing that the insurance company is going to do is going to go back to double check, are you doing all of this list of things that you said you were? Well, the minute that, the person that filled out the sheet, either was filling out things that may not be familiar to them, or the company's not keeping up on what it needs to do and its responsibilities, now that organization has a problem in terms of, have they just been paying for a policy they can't even really take advantage of, if you will. So, that's a real important arena. And certainly, looking at how much coverage do I need, shopping around for policies, making sure you understand what all it is you need to get covered, right sizing that policy annually. Those are all very, very good, kind of general rules in the cyberspace. I could keep going for an hour, but I'm going to pause.
Yeah, one thing I realized, I've been reviewing some customers' policies recently, and I've seen some lines like, for coverage to be enforceable, you must go register on this website. And that website answered a few things, but if they don't actually go through and then read their cybersecurity policy and not realizing they have a special phone number they're supposed to call within so many hours of an incident, pre-registering on this, so there's some check stuff. Oh, how bad would that be to have enhanced cybersecurity and then you didn't click some box on a website so it actually turned on, So
right.
Due diligence and all that. I mean, that's really another layer of the whole thing too, right? It's the policy you have, but you dive into it. I mean, and one thing that's not talked about enough is validating your vendors. And I can't tell you how many people sign up for us, give us the keys to the kingdom, and don't ask any questions about our own security. And, I'm like, oh, you guys, you're entrusting us to secure your networks, and you're not therefore going to ask how we're doing and what we're doing, not realizing we are actually a larger target than they are because we have the keys to everybody's kingdom. It just blows my mind. So we started just giving out how we secure ourselves, all of our policies. We're in the process of getting our high trust and our SOC. We're going to make that part of it, so that we're educating them. They should be asking these questions of every vendor, because now that vendor is part of their life and part of their security story, right? So you got to keep pushing forward down that, close the whole package up. So.
Makes
I was just going to say real quick that makes a lot of sense in terms of the companies that are out there. What a lot of them may not realize is that if they had a program for good security compliance, a good security compliance structure, some of the line items that show up on a good security and compliance plan are things like annual validation, vetting of vendors, et cetera, as well as a plethora of other items, all of which should provide them with ample coverage to be able to check the boxes off on that cyber liability application. But really stepping up the game in the security and compliance space will net them benefits for the cyber liability side as well.
Mm-hmm. And
So
I was
this-
going to add one more piece to Witt's bit there. He's 100% right. JMARK is SOC 2 Type 2, so that really means we can only do businesses with vendors that are also SOC 2 Type 2. Because if we, move client data or client information into something that's less than SOC 2 Type 2, we lose ours. So it reduces the number of vendors and clients or vendors that we can use. Otava being a SOC 2 Type 2 has made it easier for us, because we can extend client data into it, and again, following best practices for encryption and access and all that other good stuff, hardening and all that. It really reduces that threat landscape.
Makes sense. And I think this is a good segue into the last piece of this discussion, really around what is the new normal, right? And I think that's far overreaching beyond the scope of this panel and this discussion. But some of the metrics, right, that I think may make sense for us to think about. PwC did a study fairly recently, right, on some of the impact of budgets that we see in organizational spending, right? And obviously organizations are delaying or canceling major projects. They're in cost-cutting mode. But some of the interesting metrics that came out of that study were one of the top priorities for once business returns to normal is moving towards how do we put into place long-term standardized remote access, remote work processes and tools. Cybersecurity was another key area that was actually not impacted by budget or cost reductions as part of COVID and continues to be heavily budgeted by organizations looking to, again, continue to mitigate risk and exposure here. Few other metrics around CIO priorities coming out of this, right? A post-COVID-19 cybersecurity policy. I think a lot of organizations were made aware of maybe some of the inadequacies, both of their internal environment as well as certainly gaps or holes. Adam, you raised this point eloquently before around how their employees from a remote or a home environment connect into the organization, and what does that do to that organization's risk posture. And then last but not least, right, is taking a closer look at really continuity of operations planning to make sure that the risks and the impact of those risks are fully considered. Pandemic, right? You don't typically think about pandemic risk when it comes to BCPDR planning, but from a business impact analysis, from a risk horizon, it does potentially have dramatic productivity impact to the organization if it no longer can conduct business in the way that it was expecting to. I'd be curious, gentlemen, what your thoughts are. What's some of the things that you're predicting or you feel you're going to see either through conversations with your customers or trends in the market that may help inform what this new normal might look like coming out of the end of this scenario?
So from a Veeam perspective, sorry, I was just going to say real quick, from a Veeam perspective, the first thing that comes to mind is our Veeam Service Provider Console. So we do have a single pane of glass way for customers, MSPs, both to manage, distributed environments where you have a lot of physical machines or you have cloud workloads where we're using our Veeam agents to protect those. And we give you those abilities to log in to a single pane of glass and make sure that you're meeting your backups, make sure that you can protect those workloads. So,
Makes sense. Howard, you?
Sure. 10 years ago, it was centralized management of antivirus. 5 years ago, it was automation systems, like Ansible or Chef. Now, I think the answer is that everybody's going to have to be working with some sort of SIM or SOAR type of environment, EMM. It's going to be a right to play. Those BYOD environments, and not to throw a whole bunch of acronyms out there, but the bring your own device environments, enterprise mobility, those are going to be a right to play. You need the same kind of security posture on your mobile device, being Android or iPhone, as you do on your Windows 10 machine. because they're going to be doing roughly the same work. You're going to be accessing network files, network applications, maybe even a virtualized VDI. You know, you may be even accessing those line of business applications after they've been abstracted onto a mobile device. If you're doing that, you need the same security posture. It needs to be convergent. It needs to be the exact same security on that as you are on your managed device.
Makes perfect sense. Team, we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank each one of you for your input and your thought leadership here. I will close by saying I think some of the lessons that we've heard today, first and foremost, is multiple layers of defense in ransomware certainly, but in other security penetrations or attacks as well. The more, the better. Number two is I love the concept of 3-2-1, right? 3 copies of your data, 2 or more geographic separation of those data copies, and making sure that we're protecting information in the way that that is critical, because that is ultimately the lifeblood of our organization, right? Even our applications can't function without the data they depend on. I will say that look for, you see our links up here on the slide. Feel free to continue the conversation with us, right? These fine gentlemen will continue to be available to us following today's conversations. I know there was a few questions we didn't quite get to. We will follow up with you on those individually post this webinar today. And you can find this and other videos in our YouTube site as shown. Otava is, of course, a premier Veeam partner and one that is working with Veeam and our service provider community at large to provide security, holistic security, not only data protection, but also data protection both for backup and for offsite or multi-site replication. And I would encourage all of you that should this be an area of interest to you, we do have a proof of concept, unlimited size proof of concept that is available free of charge for the first 30 days. So give it a shot, and hopefully you're able to increase your security posture and minimize or limit your risk exposure. We look forward to continuing these conversations through our Job with Otava series, and look forward to talking to you again soon. Take care and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.